and welcome to this week's Squiggly Career podcast. I am Helen, one of the co-hosts of the podcast, and I'm also here with Sarah.
Hi everyone.
And we're back together because last week Sarah went solo. And
Did you get jealous? Did you get a bit jealous?
Well, you didn't acknowledge me at all, so I'm just a bit bitter. No, not at all. I loved it. So Sarah last week did a podcast recording with Bruce Daisley, who has a great podcast that we love called Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat. And he was talking to Sarah about his book, The Joy of Work, which has just come out. And it was so funny. I listened to the podcast when I was in Manchester, like a proper fan of the show. I was actually genuinely listening. And I was like, this is so interesting. And I was writing notes. And it is such... I'm allowed to say it's really good because I wasn't on it. It's such a good podcast. I learned loads from it. And Sarah, you managed it very, very well. I particularly enjoyed the monk mode that Bruce Daisley talks about in his book that you called out, Sarah, about having these points in the day where it's uninterrupted for work. And I really like that. And then the other bit I liked was, I think Bruce called them interstitials. So the breaks in our day, like when you're waiting for a bus or you're having a shower, or when our creative ideas. Yeah, but actually we've become so a bit productivity obsessed, must multitask, that actually maybe the amount of interstitials we allow ourselves to have has reduced. And does that have an impact on our creativity? I kind of pondered on that for quite a bit afterwards.
Apart from forgetting to acknowledge you, of which I'm now very sorry for, and didn't quite realise I hadn't done. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I'm only joking. It's fine. Sort of fine. Yeah. Anyway, we're still friends, everyone. It's fine.
It's probably quite apt, given we're about to talk about emotions.
Is this therapy for Sarah and Helen? So this week then, the podcast is going to be about managing emotions at work. And I think within that, we're probably focusing more on some of the negative emotions that people might feel at work. But we are talking about all of it, kind of when you're very happy, super positive, and actually kind of the other side of things. And we're going to have, a bit of a conversation between the two of us about what are our thoughts on whether showing your emotions at work is a good thing or a bad thing. Do they help us in our career, or at times do they hold us back? So we'll share some of our experiences. And then we're also going to go through our top 5 tips to help you to manage your emotions at work, which is not to say to be emotionless. It's just to be able to manage your emotions in a way that works for you.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because I was actually looking into, what is an emotion? And this is almost why it's so complicated, because even science doesn't agree on what is an emotion, which always worries me because I always think science has all the answers.
Science has the answer.
Yeah, and so apparently there's kind of 2 camps of thought in terms of emotions. Some scientists think they are hardwired, so they're evolutionary instincts. So essentially it means they're the same for everyone. And the example it gave, which then really helped me to understand it, is the Pixar film Inside Out. Have you seen it?
Okay. Is that the one where the sad one?
They basically bring to life the emotions inside the little girl's head with joy and anger.
That.
Oh, it's really good, so you should definitely watch it.
Right.
But I've also watched it a lot with my toddler. But essentially, it shows a character that is called joy, that's called sadness, that's called anger. And the idea is that essentially we all have those things in the same way. The second kind of camp of scientists think that emotions are actually learned and shaped by our culture. And actually, it's quite compelling when you start to read about it, because some cultures, for example, like Eskimos, don't have any concept of anger. Anger's just not in their world. They have different kinds of words for things that we would maybe recognise as being anger, but the way that they live and express things like sadness is just very different. And they talk a lot about how we often judge someone's emotions based on their facial expressions, which I found fascinating, because somebody's facial expression is not how they are feeling, but because we are almost conditioned to look for certain things. So if I'm smiling, there's an assumption I'm happy, but actually there's no reason why I couldn't be feeling sad. Or if my heart's beating really fast, does that mean I'm excited or does that mean I'm nervous? So it's a really interesting area to look into, and some of the resources that we will reference at the end of the podcast, if you just want to read more about kind of the science behind it, a couple of those go into more detail.
I find it really interesting when you're saying about people's faces, because often Sarah and I deliver a lot of training programs for organisations to help them with career development and making work better. And one of the things that we always have to tell ourselves is that the way somebody's face looks, that sounds awful, but their expressions is what I mean, doesn't actually determine how they might feel about it. Because sometimes people look like they're really distracted, bored, or that they're really not enjoying it. And then you go and talk to them and they're like, this course is amazing. And you're like, I never would have thought that was what you were thinking. Yeah. So I think, making assumptions based on people's expressions is a bit of a dangerous ground. So, in terms of your work then, Sarah, like how emotional do you think you get at work? Maybe like on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you think your emotions come out at work?
So are we going to talk here specifically about negative emotions, or are we talking about just like how emotional generally do I think I am?
I think emotional generally, but maybe make a distinction when you kind of do it. Maybe to make a distinction. But
because actually I went back and forth on this a little bit. And it's really interesting because I'm trying to also imagine what other people would say and how well you see yourself in these sorts of situations. I kind of got to 6 out of 10. I'm quite a pragmatic person. And I think definitely I show emotion in terms of passion and enthusiasm. The difference, actually, as I was starting to think about it, is I certainly feel a lot about work, as in internally feel a lot. And I was trying to work out, is that the same thing as... So I feel a lot of emotion, but I'm not sure I always express a lot of emotion. And I think there may be two different things. And that's partly to do with, me being a natural kind of introvert, and I am quite pragmatic. At work, I'm quite action focused. And also probably my background, if you think about the cultures that I've grown up in some very big organisations where actually probably emotion wasn't the way to get stuff done. It wasn't certainly what I've learned in terms of my own career. And so... yeah, I don't think I'm naturally that emotional, but I think I probably do have spikes in certain situations, which we'll perhaps talk about in a bit. What about you?
Oh, yeah, just before I do mine, I was thinking about a term that I came across called emotional labour, which is basically when people are trying to mask their emotions, whether it's positive or negative. And when you're talking about, I feel a lot, but I don't always express it, based on kind of that research, it would say that you're experiencing emotional labour. You're kind of putting across a different feeling, and that the longer that you do that for, and with the greater intensity. So if you're really angry and you're sort of smiling and pretending, the greater the intensity and the greater the duration that you experience emotional labour, the harder that is to deal with. And they actually talk about emotional burnout, which I think is just an interesting thing.
I recognise that, I would say. I often don't express an emotion in the moment. And almost I get often frustrated at myself afterwards for having not done that, because sometimes I think it can be helpful. But almost, maybe it's probably partly my personality, partly conditioned, that I don't think I'm that emotional in the moment. I'm often quite calm, pragmatic. If somebody is really worried about something or something's not going to plan, often I'll get feedback that I'm calm and I can help people work through it, even if maybe that's not how you're actually feeling.
Yeah, I was just thinking about mine when you said about positive and negative. I think in terms of my expressing emotion at work, I'd say about a 7. It is massively skewed by my positive emotions. So I think, interesting to see what you think, Sarah, but if I'm happy, you know it, I'm kind of bags of energy, super positive, create energy in other people. I generally don't express that much negative emotion. We'll talk about some of the different types of negative emotion maybe in a minute. But I think because I don't do it, my main probably one is a combination of frustration and irritation. And because I don't do it very often, I think when I do it, it's quite different to how I normally am. So it's suddenly people are like, oh my gosh, Helen's really annoyed.
What's this happened? Yeah.
And I had a situation about that last week, and it's almost like the way that for other people, they might not even comment on that. But because I'm normally so positive, all it takes is me to say something like, oh, for goodness sake, or is this really the best we can do, or something like that. And people are like, wow, Helen's in a terrible mood at the moment. But so I think overall probably about 7, much more because I have very visible positive emotions, I would say.
And so one of the things that I'm really interested around emotions is, how do you think this differs in terms of what you've just described, how emotional you are at work versus how emotional you are at home? So if we were both thinking about what we've just given ourselves in terms of on a scale of 1 to 10, I was then trying to work out, am I more emotional at home or less emotional? And I actually think I'm probably more emotional at home, probably because I reckon I try to take my best self to work, but I think I bring my whole self to home.
That's so true. I'm the same.
We've talked before about character and persona, and your character is your true self, your kind of authentic self, and persona, which is not a bad thing, is what you take to work every day. And of course we all have to adapt and kind of amend depending on the different situations that we find ourselves in. So actually I wonder whether that would be the same for lots of people, or whether actually for some people it's different. Maybe at home actually they're less emotional because that's where they're calmer and have more stability. I don't know.
It's funny, you spend more time at work than you do at home, but I'm more emotionally invested in the relationships I have at home. You know, like it's the relationship with my husband or my children is like my biggest emotional investment. You're my best friend and business partner. Those relationships have far more emotional investment, so they'd probably maybe have more extremes of the emotion in them. Maybe.
Yeah,
good thing to reflect on.
It is, and it's when you start to look at the research as well about gender. The role of gender in emotions, I think, is fascinating. So I think one of the articles that we'll post says that 41% of women say they've cried at work within the last year versus 9% of men. What this article talks about is that both men and women experience emotion at work, but through, more typically, women, it expresses itself through crying, whereas men, it expresses itself through exploding. So actually like getting angry or barking at somebody or kind of something, shouting at someone, something like that. What do you reckon? Do you think you fulfil the stereotypes here, or do you not really recognise either, or do you explode?
Yeah, I do. I don't think I explode. Do you think I've ever exploded?
No, I was just trying to think then. I'd quite like it if you had. It would make me laugh, but I can't. I can't
so
think
mean.
of an example. I know. Sorry.
I don't think I'm not really an exploder. There's definitely a situation or two where I've cried, and I'll talk about one of those. But I can see it in other people, though. I can definitely. If I think about people that I've managed or just peers and friends, I can see that kind of women might kind of express more kind of a tearful emotional output, whereas a guy is a bit more with words, a bit more verbose, that anger comes out in that way. It's interesting as well. There's some research that has shown that there are 5 consistent negative emotions. And so that point around men and women, they feel the same emotions. It's exactly the same. And the 5 are, the first one's frustration and irritation. The second one's worry and nervousness. The third one's anger and aggravation. The fourth one's dislike, and the fifth one's disappointment. And they're the same 5 emotions for men and women. It's just how they express them. It's different. So it's not that women are more emotional or they feel these things more than men. It's just it might potentially be more visible, but everyone is experiencing the same negative emotions.
Yeah, so should we talk about, of those 5, which ones we think we've experienced and kind of what caused it and maybe what we've done about it, if anything?
Yeah, okay, gosh, but I feel like I'm taking a deep breath. I will go first then. I think of those 5, I don't really express anger. I don't really feel anger generally, but I think for me, frustration, I find really difficult, and a bit of disappointment, I would say, are probably the 2 negative emotions that come into play for me. On the frustration one, sometimes it's about other people and their behaviour, sometimes it's about my behaviour, but sometimes when I'm frustrated, say it's in a meeting, I feel like I can't maybe express what I'm feeling, and so I will then, my eyes might fill up, and I feel like I'm not crying because I'm upset, I'm crying because I'm frustrated with the situation. And then you get in this like really annoying thing, like I don't want to cry because then you'll see and you'll think I'm upset that you said this, but I'm not upset. I'm in this horrendous emotional cycle that's mainly going on in your head and maybe your eyes. And yeah, I find that quite tricky to manage because I'm sort of expressing an emotion that I don't want to, because you can literally see it in my eyes if I'm tearing up, and it's not.
Well, I guess that's the point, isn't it, earlier about assumptions about physical things. So the assumption could be that because you're crying or your eyes are kind of welling up a bit, that you're really struggling or you're getting really upset. So the emotion could be upset, whereas actually what you're saying is the emotion is frustration.
Yes,
and they're actually quite different things.
Yeah.
That's often, I think, almost causes even more frustration because you know that you're not upset. It's just that you're frustrated.
Yeah, totally. I've definitely had cycles in my head when I've been like, stop crying, and then you kind of like, now you're getting frustrated because you're crying. And there's a book I really like that Sheryl Sandberg and Adam Grant wrote called Option B, and she talks about, can't remember the exact term, but something about like double loop emotions. So in that situation, I am frustrated, so I start to cry, and then I get frustrated because I'm crying, and you almost get stuck. So it's almost like you're stressed at work, and then you get stressed because you're stressed, and you're like, why am I so stressed? And do you see what I mean? You get in this double loop emotion that doesn't really actually work for you. And I think that sometimes happens to me if I'm feeling frustration.
Yeah, and I think I was thinking about which ones I experience the most. I actually think sometimes I do get angry, but I'm not sure people would see it. But I definitely do get angry when it's always quite a particular scenario, but it's when I think people are being unfairly treated. It's always about people, or where I think somebody's behaviour is not acceptable. I get really angry, but my reaction to that is very much to kind of internalise it. But I am almost like aggressively angry. It's just that nobody would see that. I was reading one of the books around emotion, and it gave kind of analogies as to like what happens to you when you're overly kind of emotional. And one of the pictures was of a clam, like the shell clam. And I was like, oh, I'm a clam. Because basically when I get angry, or I'm also somebody who definitely a bit more of like a worrier, at that point, in both of those scenarios, what happens to me is I become a clam. So essentially, I sort of get quite internalised, almost withdraw a little bit, stop being able to contribute to the conversation, which also gets me quite frustrated. And I almost just kind of close up. So I'm definitely not doing anything to try and resolve the situation, because I'm almost feeling my emotions so much, like you're overly feeling them. So when I was like looking at these illustrations in this book that's really good, it's called No Hard Feelings. It's got lovely like illustrations in. I was looking at it and I was just being like, oh, that's me. I'm a little clam.
I haven't read this book yet. I want to see which illustration I would have.
I think you probably might be different. I think.
Yeah, I don't think I'm a clam.
No, I don't think you are. And one of the things it talks about, if you do recognise that, and I wouldn't say I'm brilliant at these things, is that to kind of reopen and to kind of re-engage, actually what you need to do is focus on yourself, focus on what you can do, what you can improve, how you can contribute, and stop worrying about everyone else. I think there's a tendency, if you kind of are clam-like, to almost start to worry about things that are not even facts. You're worrying about feelings or implications, or what happens if this happens, or what happens if they think that, or are saying those things. And it's just like, well, are those things facts? No, they're not. So in which case, focus on what you know and what you can do for yourself. And really interestingly, it's funny how these things like always add up. I remember once doing some voice coaching through like a leadership program that I was on. And the guy that was coaching me said I'd got really shallow breathing.
Interesting
apparently,
feedback.
Yeah, apparently people who are a bit more like this do have less ability to kind of take deep breaths. And one of the things that can really help you is deep breathing. And I wonder if there's a bit of a correlation with the fact that also, like, I can't meditate. And, some of those things that I struggle with, I was like, oh my God, the picture's coming together.
Let's turn you into a research study.
Yeah, that's what I felt like when I started reading this. I was like, I'm a little specimen for this research.
A little clam specimen.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so now we've established that I'm clam-like. Should we go on to top tips to make us all feel a bit better?
Let's move on to action. Okay, so I'll go with the first one then. So the first tip that I think can help with managing your emotions is to focus on, do you know, I was going to do a really bad pun then. I was going to say be shellfish. Do you get it? So be selfish about your emotions. Oh God, it's terrible. But what I mean is focus on focus on your own emotions and not somebody else's. So you can't change how someone else is reacting to you if they're getting angry at you because you're expressing emotion. Like, that's their bag and their emotion. What you can do is focus on yourself. Now, if you are expressing one of the emotions that you might not want to, or it's coming out in a way that you don't want to, one of those 5 emotions that we talked about, then I found some research that's quite interesting, which says that the most effective thing that you can do is to create some kind of pause between the situation and your response. And the advice that the person gave, she's written a book, a lady's called Anne Creamer, who's written a book called Always Personal, Navigating Emotion in the New Workplace. The advice she says to create that pause between the situation and your response is to get up and get a glass of water. So let's say you're having a conversation, it has become difficult to you, and you're experiencing one of those emotions, maybe the frustration, anger, irritation, whatever it is, and potentially maybe you feel you feel like you're going to explode, like Sarah said, or maybe you feel like you're going to cry. If you get up and go and get a drink of water, so you might say, I'm just going to grab a drink of water, be back in 1 minute, what happens is the physical movement of your body resets your parasympathetic, I think that's how you say it, nerve system, and it forces your body into a different mindset. The idea of physically getting up can help you just to get a little bit of control over your emotions. You're basically looking to get a little bit of a pause. So be selfish, concentrate on your responses, and then in the moment, if you can, try not to react immediately. Create some kind of pause. Potentially getting up, that kind of bodily movement can help you reset and be a bit more in control of the response that you want to have.
Great. So the second top tip is to remember that your feelings aren't facts. And I do find this really helpful. Someone once said to me, always be really clear in work whether what you're saying is an opinion or a fact. And opinions and feelings are completely valid and really useful, but they aren't objective facts. And it's worth just remembering that. And there's a really lovely quote from Alain de Botton, who is a philosopher, and he's also the founder of the School of Life. And he says, every human will frustrate, anger, annoy, madden, and disappoint us. And we will, without any malice, do the same to them. And I think that's so meaningful, and I can really understand that, because I often think there's a real difference between intent and impact. I always like to hope and think that the majority of people come to work and do their jobs with a really positive intent, that they are trying their best and that you want to achieve good things. But sometimes the impact of maybe how something is communicated or how somebody responds to a situation doesn't feel positive. But often you correlate those two things together. You kind of go, well, somebody's just got really angry or got really upset or just been negatively emotional. And then you'll correlate that back to the intent that they're trying to have. And I think just sometimes remembering, if you start on that assumption that everybody is trying their best and that feelings are valid but they're not fact, I think that really helps you to start thinking about your own emotions. So how do you regulate your own emotions? And I really like this idea of emotional regulation and actually just using your emotions wisely and usefully for yourself, but also about how you kind of react to others. Because sometimes it's about your own emotions, sometimes it's about how you react to other people who are being emotional in what perhaps feels like a kind of negative way.
I really like that quote.
Yeah, it's good.
It's really, it kind of also, it's like you have a right to be emotional. I think that's probably my tip number 3, actually, is that you don't have to be perfect and positive all the time. You can show some vulnerability and you can show some of these negative emotions. You definitely shouldn't turn them off. I'm actually getting really interested in a researcher and a professor at Cass Business School. Is a guy called Andre Spicer. I'm intending to meet him very soon. I just need to get it in the diary. But he has done quite a lot of work on why actually it's not great to be positive all the time, and why just talking about being happy at work almost sets people up to fail, and that actually expressing some kind of negative emotions is actually a lot healthier. I think it's worth, I will link to some of his writing. It is really interesting. And there was one piece of research that I read about people who, it's something about like drinking a glass of water. So they did some research, and the people that imagined themselves drinking a lovely glass of water were then less inclined to go and make some effort to get it. And the insight was that actually sometimes positive thinking doesn't actually always help motivation, and that actually sometimes some negative feelings and negative emotions can actually drive action in a different way. So they are not all bad, and actually being positive all the time, and especially pretending to be positive when you don't feel it, creates that kind of emotional labour and burnout thing.
Do you know, I once got that exact feedback at work about being too positive. So I think because I am naturally a positive person and try to bring that enthusiasm to what I do, somebody actually who was brilliant, who I worked for, said to me, it is okay sometimes to say that things are not going well, and to say that there's a problem or that something's challenging or you're finding something difficult. You don't have to be universally positive, because essentially people know that it's not realistic. So it's not very nuanced in your approach. And this was feedback based on also me progressing and wanting to kind of move into more senior roles. And, you know, their point was, you've got to be able to take the rough with the smooth, and you need to be able to demonstrate that you understand that and can adapt. And it goes back to this agility. So the two things I was reading a bit about, one was emotional regulation, the other one was emotional agility. And sometimes like knowing and picking those moments when actually you do need to say, okay, this doesn't feel like we're in a good place, and I don't feel good about where we are with this project, this is why. And not just to be like, no, it'll be okay, we'll find a way, which I know sounds like potentially a better way, but it isn't always helpful. And so the fourth top tip, which took me a little while to get my head around, but I think I agree with it, is to care a bit less. So initially I was like, I don't know, because I think work is such a big part of our identity now. It's really important to kind of care about your work. But then when I started to read about this, essentially what they're really talking about is the tipping point of like, when are you caring too much? So you know that thing of you can get a bit addicted to work, and certainly you and I have both been there, and you're so in it that you are almost like obsessively taking phone calls or checking your phone all the time, or almost like I couldn't possibly be away for like one day, everything's going to fall over without me. And again, in that No Hard Feelings book, they got some really good illustrations of like people like being on the beach and sort of like paddling, but also being on the phone, being like, yeah, no, it's absolutely fine to chat now. And to be honest, I thought, actually, I don't have to think that far back to examples of where I've done something a tiny bit like that. Not quite as extreme, but it is okay to care a bit less, because actually for your own self-care, and I think self-care is being talked about much more now, there is no shortage of evidence that we all need breaks, that you need to spend time doing things that is not work related with people who are not work related for your own mental health and well-being. And if you do that, you will be better at your job anyway. So almost what I got to, my conclusion was, if you do really care about your work, then you need to care about self-care, because it will make you even better at your work.
Ah, that's a nice way. So, yeah.
Thanks.
I
was quite proud of that.
Less, but self-care more.
Yeah, equals caring more at work.
Okay, I like it. I like your spin. So my last tip is about managers, actually, because I think managers can do a lot to help or hinder emotions at work. So if you're a manager and you're pretending everything's perfect and positive all the time, you're not really creating an environment that's going to be comfortable for other people to express their emotions. Also, if you don't ever entertain other people's emotions, so if someone's kind of seems a bit upset or seems a bit angry and you get really awkward and you're like, okay, well, we'll just catch up next week, then you're not allowing people to express that at work. And there's, again, some stuff that I read that said that actually kind of these people that are hiding their emotions or feel that they can't express it, they ultimately become quite resentful at work and less productive. So this is not a great thing for the organisation. What I think managers can do is, the first thing is to create a sense of psychological safety at work. There's been an awful lot of research done on this by somebody called Amy Edmondson. And you can find a lot of it through the Google's, is it called Rework? Google's,
Rework, yeah.
Google
Rework,
stuff.
Yeah.
You can find a lot of Amy Edmondson's research there. So the first thing is create an environment where people feel safe to share emotion. And then sometimes you have to invite them as a manager. So you have to ask them how they feel. You might need to create a situation where there's a bit of a prompt for them to express it. And not only have you got to invite them to share how they feel, how you're feeling at the moment, what's on your mind, you've also then got to make the time to listen. So it's not as easy as at the end of a one-to-one, when you've got 2 or 3 minutes left, you going, so how are you feeling at the moment? And then you go, okay, well, I've got to go now because I've got a meeting. Like you've opened Pandora's box. So they'd be my 3 things. Create psychological safety for your team, model some of the behaviours like Sarah said earlier. Second, invite people to express their feelings. And third, make sure you make time to listen for it.
And actually, one of the top tips I took from my mental health first aider course is the difference between asking, oh, how are you feeling or how are you doing, versus how are you feeling today or how are you doing today. So again, just when you're asking that question, grounding it in that particular moment, in that kind of work situation. And then, as you say, giving people the space to then tell you, because often it's when you ask that, that's when I've seen people then actually get quite upset. Because actually, then suddenly you've just given them permission to say, actually, I'm feeling really bad, whether it's something to do with work or not. But you have got to give people the time. So sometimes it's not a bad way to start a conversation, even if it means you don't get through the to-do list. If there's something really on someone's mind, I think asking it at the start rather than at the end is another good tip.
That's actually something that comes up again in the that Option B book that I mentioned. So I'll link that in the resources. Option B is specifically about bereavement, really. It talks about Sheryl Sandberg's losing her husband, and as it sounds horrible to say as a story for the book, but as a constant to think about how you can help people dealing with bereavement at work and also deal with it yourself. So I guess in the context of emotions for this podcast, it could be a useful read for you. So we will put all the resources. We've got loads of resources this week because I think the more Sarah and I got into this, the more articles and research we
the more
found.
carried away we got, basically.
Yeah, we just got really, really interested in it. I feel like I could do lots of podcasts on this. So all of the things that we found that interested us, there's some articles, there's linked to books, there's some videos we will put on the blog that accompanies this podcast. So go over to amazingif.com and you'll find that article there. So next week then, the topic we're going to cover is influence at work. We're going to be, whether it's kind of people, projects, outcomes, we're going to be looking at some of the theory behind influence, talk about some stuff that's worked for us at work as well, and make sure as ever you get loads of actionable tips so that you can hopefully improve your influence at work as well.
And as always, thanks so much to everybody who shares the podcast with your friends, colleagues, family, and takes the time to review the podcast. We really do appreciate it, and it makes a real difference to us reading all your feedback. If you do want to recommend a podcast topic, this week's was actually one that kind of was a request that came through to us. Please do let us know. You can get in touch with us on Instagram at AmazingIf, follow us on Twitter at amazing_if, or just drop us an email at getintouch@amazingif.com. Love to know your thoughts, love to know your ideas. We read everyone and they make us super happy.
They do.
So thanks very much for listening today, and we look forward to speaking to you again next week. Bye for now.
Bye.